Thank you. So I'll be doing the first half of the presentation, and Ellen will take over in the second half of it. So over the course of the next 45 minutes, we'll just give you a bit of background about the center and the kinds of activities we're planning to participate in, both research and knowledge mobilization activities, capacity building as well in terms of academic research capacity building, and community capacity building as well to be involved in research. The center the center is based at McMaster in a virtual way. Obviously, Ellen, MacEachen, and myself are both based here at the Institute for Work and Health, but the SSHRC funding that we received, which is for a period of 7 years, is flowing through McMaster, and that's why we had the launch at McMaster University at the McMaster Health Forum. It was a week ago. It was Tuesday morning at noontime we had the launch. So we're just going to talk about opportunities and challenges that we're planning to confront and deal with over the next 7 years. Our website is up and running. Thank you very much, Ron, for mentioning the acronym. We're trying to get people comfortable with saying that really quickly, CRWDP. And it actually is quite easy once you get into it. You practice it 2 or 3 times, it'll roll off your tongue. And that way you'll remember where to find us, because we're trying to use the website as a go-to place, a connection place for all the people involved in this initiative, particularly because we're quite a large initiative across Canada. We have clusters in British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, and Newfoundland. So we're trying to connect virtually through our website, amongst other ways. So over the course of the next 45 minutes, I'm going to talk about work disability policy contexts and challenges. That's what we're up against, is thinking about the work disability policy system as we describe it. And I'm going to just talk about what we mean when we talk about the work disability policy system. The variation across different programs and access to these programs, some of the underlying philosophies of these programs, and the broader context as well. The labor market, employer roles, they're all part of the work disability policy system. And then Ellen, in particular, in her part of the presentation, she'll get into some of the details of the initiative and the kinds of activities that we'll be participating in, some of the questions and themes that are driving the initiative. The partnership, it's actually described as a partnership. The funding envelope from SSHRC is a partnership grant, and then knowledge mobilization activities as well. So our objective, we mentioned that we launched on February 4th. We actually received the funding, though, in the spring of 2013, but we've been setting up the whole structure of this initiative, connecting with our partners, getting our website together. Our first newsletter is out as well. It's available on our website, and then preparing for this official launch on February that happened last week. But it's a transdisciplinary initiative, and I use that word to describe sort of the kind of philosophical approach we're taking on our activities. We have 51 academics involved in it, and they're come from various disciplines. As you can imagine, work disability policy is a complex policy arena that requires lenses from different disciplinary backgrounds, and we're trying to bring all of these different disciplinary backgrounds into the umbrella of the work that we're doing. And we're looking at the future of work disability policy in Canada. And in fact, that was the title of our grant when we first submitted it to SSHRC, was about the future of work disability policy in Canada. So our objective ultimately is to identify how people, when they're disabled, can be better retained and integrated into the labor market. And that's sort of the driving umbrella goal of our initiative, is think of how we can do a better job as a society, as Canadians, to make sure that the labor market is accessible for all people, even when they're disabled or have some health condition that might compromise their abilities, whether it's short-term, intermediate-term, or long-term condition, that they can be retained in the labor market if they can and want to work, and some of them need to work. So CRWDP is going to lay the foundations for a national, evidence-informed, coordinated approach to supporting people with disabilities in Canada. This is a photograph of that we took at the beginning of our launch. Some important people at McMaster. Patrick Dean is the president of McMaster. We know this person. Charlotte Yates is the Dean of Social Sciences. This is Mrs. Onley, the Honorable David Onley, myself, and this is the gentleman from SHRC, is Brent Herbert Copley. I got that. I'm not very good with remembering names, so I'm surprised. Okay, so two of our champions were at our launch, and we have a champions group that consists of more people than just these two. In fact, Alec, who's just coming in, is the lead of our champions group. Sorry to put you on the spot, Alec, just as you took your coat off. And he is coordinating the efforts of what we call champions is figureheads who are well known in the popular society, whether in certain circles or more broadly to the general population, who will kind of spearhead the initiatives, activities in terms of promoting what we're doing, making sure that people are aware of it, helping maybe with uptake in certain circles, sort of thing. So we thought this was really important because we're such a large initiative covering such a complex area that we need to have these champions kind of promoting what we're doing on an ongoing basis. And so this launch was the start of kind of introducing that notion of these champions, and these two champions actually were key people speaking at our launch last week. So the Honorable David Onley came to talk about some of his activities that he's been part of. He's identified accessibility as a key part of his mandate as the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. Mike Bradley, who is the Mayor of Sarnia, doing some really great stuff. He's been involved in promoting disability issues for quite some time. He started this thing called the Mayor's Challenge to hire persons with disabilities in the municipal services. For a number of years, he's been promoting that and has hired a number of people with learning disabilities in the municipal services in Sarnia, and is encouraging other municipalities to do the same thing. So they're two of our key champions, and we're going to keep growing this champions group with the help of Alec Farquhar. So our population health focus. So work disability actually touches most people at some point over their lifetime. And in the past, we've thought of disability as being a marginal issue, a small subset of the population that has, these long-term chronic or conditions that are permanent. But we like to frame it in a different way, because ultimately, at some point in our lives, we all have health conditions that might compromise our ability to engage in various aspects of our various social roles, whether it's short-term, intermediate-term, or long-term. As the population ages, it's very common to have some kind of chronic or episodic condition onset as you get older, kind of thing, and it might compromise your ability to fully engage. So we all get affected by it. It may not even be ourselves directly. It might be someone in our family. And actually, David, in his speech at the launch, had mentioned, and I'm not sure where he got the statistic, but about 50% of Canadians are touched by disability either directly themselves or through someone in their family. So clearly, it's an issue that ultimately affects all of us at some point in our lives, directly or indirectly. In terms of statistics, about 15.5% of Ontarians have some kind of disability, and that statistic is probably the same in most provinces in Canada. So if we do a cross-sectional count of how many people are currently being affected by a health condition, whether it's temporary or permanent, chronic or episodic, it's about 15.5% of the population. More than 50% of Canadians, as I mentioned, are touched by disability at some point in their lives. And as I mentioned also, the aging of the Canadian population means that more people, as they get older, will have some kind of onset of health conditions that might need some kind of supports to help them continue their engagement in the labor market. So really, I'm just trying to make a case that it's something that's really important to all of us. So it's not really a marginal issue as we've thought of it in the past. It's about Canadian society. Ultimately, health is important to all of us and is critical for our engagement in all our social roles, and particularly the work role, which is sometimes critical for our sustaining our livelihood. So some people want to work, others need to work in order to maintain their livelihood. So when we think about that in that way, there's lots of lost opportunities if we don't address it in the best way possible. labor force productivity and output is very much contingent on the inclusion of all the adults who can and want to work, regardless of their ability status. And if we think of it in that way, think about all the lost output and productivity that Canadian society might be compromising if we don't address this issue of having a work disability policy system that really gives the supports that people need when they have compromised health for whatever reason, or compromised functioning as well. So 54% of working age Canadians with disabilities, which is approximately 3.8 million individuals, are unemployed. So it's quite a high statistic. And David Onley, in his speech, mentioned this number as well, and emphasized that if this was true for all Canadians, if 54% of Canadians in general were unemployed, we think of it as a serious crisis. Yet we seem to not take a lot of issue with the fact that such a large fraction of people with disabilities are unemployed. He talked about the Great Depression when 25% of the population was unemployed, and he thought of this as a huge crisis, and it was a long period of time, over 10 years in the 30s, but this is a permanent situation for people with disabilities, that this number had continued to be unemployed for long periods of time, and very little attention given to the fact that these people obviously need some kind of supports from the work disability policy system to help them engage more actively in the labor market. So various studies suggest that many more individuals face limitations such as chronic and episodic health conditions that leave them underemployed. So some of these statistics may be underreported. Some people are, for various reasons, reticent to identify themselves as someone with disabilities with their employers, for fear that they might be marginalized, that they might lose their job if they come forward with admitting that they have, say, a mental health condition that affects them at some periods over their life course, or a physical thing that may be invisible, like chronic pain or something like that. So these numbers might actually be underestimated when we look at the percentages of people who come forward and admit that they have some kind of health condition that results in a disability at some point in their lives. So we want to, I want to also mention this one piece of publication that came out recently, Rethinking Disability in the Private Sector. It's quite a good document that lays out a very clear business case for employing people with disabilities. And that's something that's been emphasized by a few people who spoke at the launch, that we need to really think of this as opportunities rather than charity, or that we're doing a good turn because of social consciousness. There's really opportunities there that are lost. There is a business case for hiring people with disabilities, and in fact sometimes there's a stigma associated with hiring because you think it's going to be expensive to accommodate somebody who has a disability, but when they did their research that's published in this disability in the private sector, Rethinking Disability in the Private Sector, they found that 50% of cases, people with disabilities required no accommodation at all. Really it's maybe just a social issue, stigma associated with hiring them. And in 37% of cases required only a one-time cost of $500. So really, when you think about that, why aren't we hiring more people with disabilities? When there's 54% of them unemployed, really some of it's has not got to do with real barriers, but social barriers and stigma, rather than some legitimate reason that it's expensive to accommodate people with disabilities, when a large fraction of them require very nominal amounts of upfront expenses in order to make the context of work for them. So the work disability context, one of the things we emphasize in the work that we're doing too is we need to realize that the nature of work and workers is changing, as well as the need to rethink how the disability policy system needs to be modified to accommodate the nature of work and workers today. Our Canadian disability policy system was developed in a different time period when it was serving pockets of need that may not be relevant today anymore. So what we have is a very fragmented support system in Canada, and I'll go through the detailed components of it in a subsequent slide. They have different eligibility requirements. So if you're familiar with some of the components like Canada Pension Plan and workers' compensation or social assistance for people with disabilities, they really have different eligibility requirements and very little coordination across these programs, even though people tend to access various parts of the system at different points over the life course. There's very little coordination between them, and that's one of the things we're really trying to look into more deeply, how we can do a better job of coordinating the different types of supports that are currently available. The changing nature of work and workers, when we think about the labor market today, most people do not have a full-time permanent job that's going to last until 65. That was maybe the norm in a different era. Yet a lot of these programs were designed around that concept that you're contributing to these programs and they're available there for you when you have a short-term absence or maybe a long-term absence because you're connected to a particular employer over the lifetime. But now people are in contingent employment. They're in short-term contract jobs. They might be self-employed. In fact, about half of the labor force is in those kinds of forms of employment today. If you remember seeing in the media recently some data from Wayne Luchuk, who had found that about 50% of people are in precarious types of employment arrangements, and they're not in standard permanent full-time jobs. So those kinds of programs that we developed in a different era are no longer available for a lot of people at times, so they fall through the cracks as a result and don't get any supports in many cases. As well, when we think about the current economic climate, that's another layer that adds some complexity to it. There's efforts, maybe to be more efficient and resourceful with existing expenditures in different programs, but oftentimes there's an effort to maybe further restrict eligibility in a lot of these programs, cutting more people off of benefits in order to reduce public sector expenditures. But that's obviously not the way to go if we want these people to get the supports they need to be able to continue in the labor market. And also, so ultimately, a lot of injured workers and people with disabilities fall through the cracks, and we've seen this a lot through other work we've done in the workers' compensation field, but we're also seeing this obviously in the broader disability community. And we have some video stories that I'm going to play one of them later on in this presentation of people talking about their experiences with the disability policy system and how they've fallen through the cracks. So we're also we're trying to bridge the program divide. So although disability benefits and labor market supports can cut across multiple levels, even the systems actors from the various programs rarely interact with each other, and so the need for more coordination is really critical. In Canada, there's at least 7. I would change that number to maybe 8 or 9 different disability support programs. It's quite a complex system, spanning both provincial and federal level jurisdictions. They also span public and private sector domains. So some, like workers' compensation, may be mandatory, and others are non-obligatory, such as private insurance that some employers provide to their workers as a payroll benefit. This distinction is also made between work and non-work injuries and illnesses, with support provisions provided for each of those being very different based on cause. So as you can see, all of these criterion of eligibility or not eligible can ultimately result in somebody falling through the cracks. So here is just a quick overview of some of the programs that exist in our system, and I'll just quickly go through them. Canada Pension Plan, or Quebec Pension Plan, or its counterpart, have a disability component to it. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but you have to be wholly or substantially disabled, so you can't work at all in order to qualify. So obviously a lot of people don't meet that condition because they have a disability which does compromise their ability to participate in the labor market, but not wholly or substantially. That's a contributory program. If you're working either as an employee or self-employed, you contribute to that program. There's employment insurance sickness benefits, which are just short-term, about 16 weeks. So if you're unable to work for a short period of time, you can access employment insurance sickness benefits, but obviously you have to contribute to it. So some self-employed people may not be contributing to that. Employment-based long-term disability plans are private insurance plans that some workers have. About 55% of people who are in salary jobs have employment benefits that are for as short-term and long-term disability through private insurance through their employer. There's the provincial workers' compensation benefits that only cover some sectors. There's provincial social assistance disability benefits. That's a means-tested program, so you have to be poor, have no resources, no savings in order to qualify for that, and it's substantially below the poverty line. So it's really a program of last resort for many people. There's also disability tax credits and registered disability savings plans. So through the tax system, there's some supports. It requires you to have tax deductible earnings in order to qualify for them. So it's only some people can access that. A very specialized program for people who are in the armed forces, so have veterans benefits for disability if they become disabled through their work. There's other programs as well, a battery of different ones. Car insurance might be a big one, compensation for victims of crime, so very special pockets of situations that people may qualify for as well. I mentioned the notion of some of them being cause-based, so delineating the support based on the etiology of the condition that results in an impairment. So work-caused injuries and illnesses are supported through workers' compensation. It's obligatory if you're in a covered sector. It only covers certain types of work-caused injuries and illnesses, so something like mental health generally wouldn't be covered. If you're not in a covered sector, you wouldn't qualify either. So some people do not or don't have access to workers' compensation for a variety of reasons. If they're not in a covered sector, they might be in lots of short-term contract jobs that ultimately it's very difficult for them to access. If they work through a temping agency as well, it might be difficult for them to access workers' compensation. If you don't qualify for workers' compensation, then there's a whole battery of other programs which I listed in the previous slide, so non-work caused injuries and illnesses. There's the employment insurance sickness benefit for people who are contributing to that. If you have private disability insurance through your employer, you might qualify for that as well. CPPD if you're wholly or substantially disabled. And then there's social assistance, as I mentioned, which is one of last resort because it's means tested, so you have to be poor and have no resources in order to qualify for it. So it's a complicated system, as you can see, and very difficult to figure out exactly where you fit if you're a person in need of supports. And as you can imagine, the bureaucracy amongst and between these programs can be quite substantial as well. So that might be an overwhelming thing too, is how to access some of these programs. Particularly if you don't speak English, if you're a recent immigrant, English isn't your first language, that adds another layer of barriers to trying to access some of these programs. So this is just an example of how the same injury, but for the fact of what kind of work you have might result in different level of supports. This is an example that's just a fictitious one, but very representative of some of the complexity that happens to different people. So this is a work accident happens for a particular individual while they're driving. They drive for work, maybe doing deliveries, and they have a serious injury where they may possibly a spinal cord injury that results in a permanent impairment, and that the resources that person would have available to them would vary dramatically depending on the nature of their employment contract. If they were self-employed, they might have a limited set of options. If they're employed in a sector that's not covered by workers' compensation, they might have a few more options. If they're employed in a sector that's covered by workers' compensation, they might have a bit more options, because then there's the workers' compensation that might cover them as well. So the self-employed worker would obviously not have workers' compensation unless they purchase it, which few people would, but they would likely also not have private insurance because they would also have to purchase that, and many people opt not to. I would imagine the self-employed sector, so they wouldn't have the option of private insurance or workers' compensation insurance in most cases. So the only other options then would be Canada Pension Plan Disability, which is an obligatory contribution from any earnings, whether self-employed or employed. And then there's also social assistance, which is a means tested one, as I mentioned. So these provide very modest benefits and often below the poverty line. I think for Canada Pension Plan Disability, it's about $1,000 a month, and for social assistance, it's about $600 a month. So either of them would be very nominal earnings, and they also they are coordinated in a certain way where social assistance will deduct anything you get from any other program. So you wouldn't even qualify for social assistance if you qualified for the Canada Pension Plan disability. In a non-covered sector, maybe some of them may have private insurance. They would be also eligible for the Canada Pension Plan and ultimately also for social assistance. Now, the workers' compensation covered sector, they would be qualified to receive workers' compensation if this was a work accident. They'd also be eligible for Canada Pension Plan disability and social assistance. And Canada Pension Plan disability, if you qualified for both that and the workers' compensation would actually deduct what you get from part of what you get from Canada Pension Plan disability. So they treat the public parts of the programs as the key program that contributes, and they subtract off any incremental amounts that you get from other sources. So as I mentioned, we have on our website a number of worker stories that give you some sense of the lived experiences of some of these people. These are a few of them that we currently have on there, and we'll be adding more to them. I want to play just one of them for you, Eugene's story, to give you a feel of some of the personal experiences that these people have with the work disability policy system. Okay, so you can see just from his story, I mean, he's gone through social assistance and workers' comp and bounced between the two, and that's not an uncommon experience. In fact, a number of the stories that we have, they've gone through various program supports through, workers' comp or social assistance and Canada Pension Plan disability, trying to find some place to get their supports, and just that struggle of trying to access these services consumes a large part of their lives because these programs aren't really coordinated. So very little attention spent on actually trying to get engaged in the labor market, get back into work, because a lot of their efforts are trying to just get the supports they need to survive through that transition period of living with a disability, in this case a permanent one kind of thing. And so it really exemplifies the need for better coordination across these programs in order to focus on the supports they need to get back into the labor market. And I like his emphasis of thinking of him as an asset rather than a liability, which is what most of the programs frame their claimants as. If we think of them as a valued commodity that can contribute to the labor market in a meaningful way, we focus more on providing those supports to get them back into the labor market.
Thank you. Okay, so now I would like to talk to you a little bit about some of the concepts around disability and also tell you about our center and how it's organized. Emile mentioned we're a large group of people, 51 academics across Canada, across all different disciplines, 46 partners from community, business, government. So people are coming at this concept of disability from all different angles. And here at the Institute for Work and Health, we have our own ways often of thinking about this term. We have to be conscious of what we mean when we say disability. And so, for instance, in these stats CAN numbers, that's just one definition of disability. A model that is often, and programs use different concepts, different definitions. So the medical model is basically a model of disabilities just focusing on what you can't do, what your body can't do anymore. Focus on individual bodies, biology, and some plans such as Canada Pension Plan, Disability, Social Assistance are looking at those sorts of things. What can your individual body no longer do that creates some sort of reason why you can't work and need to be supported? A socio-medical model is another way of thinking about disability, not just what is the issue with your body, but what is the issue with the environment that creates a barrier for you to access jobs and activities in life. In the socio-medical model, the health condition is a necessary condition, but not, it doesn't mean everything. It's about the person in context. And so it creeps in a little bit in workers' compensation with assessments such as loss of earnings capacity, because it looked at what you used to do, and so you're looking at the context a little, although many would argue that workers' compensation generally would have more of a tension toward the medical model. There's also a human rights model focusing on society, not the individual. So what is the right of every individual, every citizen in Canada to access work, to access transportation, to access recreational activities? And the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities was ratified by Canada quite recently. So this just sort of gives you an overview of different models, and they're embedded in different ways in our different programs, which makes it fairly complex. And if you talk to lawyers at legal aid clinics, they're trying to help people gain access to pension from one program or another. They're going crazy with these different definitions of disability and the different forms and that they have to fill out. There are sociopolitical challenges as well with these different ways of understanding disablement. Workers' compensation is a legal right that workers want, a historical compromise where workers gave up their right to sue their employers in response for a no-fault arrangement that provides wage replacement, medical, vocational supports. And yet people on social assistance, it's a very different framework of providing support to them. We also have a human rights code that requires, but in order to access that, individuals have to complain. You have to say that your rights have been breached in order to gain protection on that. And it's relevant to employed individuals, also in relation to hiring, especially in the federal environment. So our mandate at the Centre for Research on Work Disability Policy is to consider all of these issues. Emile mentioned different programs, the challenges with them. I've mentioned some of the socio-political dimensions, some of the conceptual complexities, to bring people together. Program providers, employers, people accessing the programs, families, to identify the problems and the challenges associated with program coordination and complexity, to facilitate dialogue, and to facilitate projects. A lot of our funding is to fund research projects and to fund students to build capacity on research. Ultimately, we're aiming to build a roadmap for work disability policy change. So I think we've mentioned several times the size of this initiative. We have the head office is here in Toronto, but we have regional clusters at York University here in Ontario, at University of Laval in Quebec, Memorial University in Newfoundland, and University of British Columbia in BC. And each one of those clusters has administrative support and a group of researchers and partners working in those regions. Because of course, when you're looking at work disability policy, there are provincially relevant issues as well as federally. And included in amongst all of our partners and participants, we have 15 different research institutions, so there's a lot of power behind it. And so sometimes when we've been describing our initiative to the media, we say we're almost like a mini university. I mean, we are so many people combined focusing on this issue of applied work disability policy, and our focus is very strongly directed to training students in this area. And so we have a substantial amount of money that's been provided to us, almost $3 million, and even more than that in matching and in-kind contributions from our partners. Part of our mandate is bringing together stakeholders. For instance, drawing in employers. We do have employers involved, but it's an ongoing activity and challenge for us. If we're focusing on our main issue is employment, employers, of course, are the gateway. Also, bringing together stakeholders from the injured worker community and the disability communities can be challenging. They operate differently. They have their own advocacy groups. They have their own programs that they're accessing. Even though we have clearly observed how injured workers can bounce from program to program if they don't meet eligibility requirements for workers' compensation. But in general, we do have communities. We have, in general, an occupational health community in one silo, and in general, a disability community in another silo. And we've been bringing people together with some pretty good success, I think, so far. Academics as well operate within those silos. Our key research questions are how well does the current system serve the current and the emerging needs of working age individuals when disabled, which could be temporary or permanent in terms of employment supports and opportunities. How does it work for different groups of individuals, and what are key opportunities for policy and program improvement? We have people organized into 3 main research themes. There's population analyses, which is basically who are the work disabled, what is their condition, so focusing on the people. The labor market analysis is focusing on the context in which people work, what are the types of jobs available, what does the labor market look like, what sorts of contracts are people tending to have when they work these days. And then we have a section looking at law, policy, and program analysis, looking at, for instance, comparisons amongst provincial programs. We're also doing international comparisons, trying to understand some of those issues. People have said to us as we were developing this, people have been looking at work disability policy before, so what are you guys doing that's new? Well, the main thing that's new that we're doing is what I just described, is bringing together that occupational health community and that disability community. And there's a lot of energy that can feed each of the communities. The disability community brings this whole human rights perspective that we don't talk about very much in workers' comp. The workers' comp community brings issues of return to work and work reintegration that are not as strongly understood or discussed in the disability community. And so that's what's new about what we're doing now. We also find that people are increasingly interested in working in partnership. We have a good experience of working with community partners through the SSHRC Community University Research Alliance that Emile led with Steve Tompa, and I was strongly involved with. So we worked very closely with the community there. Also, we have other research relationships. For instance, a CIHR Work Disability Training Grant that some people in the room are involved with, that has brought together people from around the world and from across disciplines to focus on this topic. And many people from the other areas of the world, Europe, don't have these divides between workers' comp and disability. And so they have very interesting perspectives on this topic. And so we are forming partnerships with as broad a community as possible. We also have people who've been coming to us and saying, this is such an important topic. You guys are here. Can we talk to you? Can we work together? So we have Employment and Social Development Canada, formerly known as HRSDC, who've approached us, and we've had some really good meetings with them. The Ministry of Labour, the Ministry of Community and Social Services, other networks like the Episodic Disabilities Network. So we're having some really very interesting discussions with people who would like to become part of this larger conversation. And the other thing is that the timing is right. With these disability support programs, for instance, Ontario Disability Support, they're increasingly saying our costs are rising too much. We need to, find ways that we don't just keep adding people onto employment support or income support. And so they're exploring ideas of return to work, which is a little newer for some of the other programs. Meanwhile, workers' comp has been doing return to work for eons, but they're struggling with chronic, episodic types of health problems that people have who are injured on the job, and that doesn't quite fit the way workers' comp works. And so it's an interesting timing where the problems of the programs are beginning to overlap with each other. We're organized within our research center to have people work together. So at senior levels of governance, we are coordinated by both academics and partners working together. Every research project that we fund, a requirement is that the researchers working with partners. And we have a process for identifying and executing research studies. For instance, we have a hot topics initiative that we'll be launching soon, which are topics that partners have come to us and said, we wish that you would look at this topic. It's so important to our community. And we have 51 researchers out there, and probably one or two would be interested. And the way we've set it up as well with our provincial clusters is that we have a dual leadership component, and one leader from the workers' comp community, the other leader for the disability community, so that we have the disciplinary divides coming together in leadership as well. And so we hope this environment will provide students who we fund with a sort of a transdisciplinary model that transcends some of the previous barriers that we've had. We have a number of different knowledge mobilization highlights. So we have, as I've already mentioned, partner involvement. I mentioned at the senior level, but actually we have a number of different committees and activities, and people are all involved. Emile's mentioned that we have champions involved, so that helps us to get the message out at the political level. And we have internships planned for students to work with different partner organizations, and people who have disabilities wanting to gain experience could be working with employers as well. We'll be bringing together stakeholders at policy roundtable discussions. We'll be having national symposia. We have our website set up with newsletters coming out. We'll be having webinars. We have the digital stories of people's experiences. You heard one of them already. And a number of different products to get the message out. Ultimately, we're hoping to have a national consensus on specific policy solutions, starting off with a national discussion. Workability policy established as a field of research in Canada. We just want to push the agenda on that topic. And ultimately, the reason for doing all of this is to find a way in Canada to have better opportunities for labour market integration. Right now we have a system where sometimes people who need a bit of support to get into the labour market aren't finding it, and other people, for various bureaucratic reasons, on benefits, and it's too risky to get a job and go off because of the losses that you would suffer. So we have a system that actually in some ways works against participation in the labour market, which seems very ironic, but that's a challenge. And so that's what we're aiming for as well. Thank you.